So good morning, everybody. My name is John Macomber. I'm a finance professor at Harvard Business School, and I'm really happy to be here today to talk to all of you about healthy buildings, and particularly the financial incentives to develop and build healthy buildings. So a lot of this is around how engineers, contractors, architects, people like that can talk to building owners and decision makers and property managers about healthy buildings. And I have a number of ways I'd like to address this. Partly is sort of a pre-COVID in terms of cognition and health. Second is during COVID, and the last is post-COVID, what's going to happen going forward. So I hope you find that useful for what all of you do. And then the next two speakers after me will both be talking about ventilation and air purification. So I think that'll make a lot of sense. So let me share the screen. The basic idea here is I'll talk for a very short amount of time, 20 or 30 minutes, and then most of the time will be in Q&A. So I find that the most interesting part is the Q&A and learning about what's on your minds. And you'll be typing your questions into the question box, and they'll be read to me by Melissa or by Kimberly. So let me see if I can duck around all my screens. And Kimberly, do you see the title slide on here?
Yes, I do.
Oh, good, good. So I'll continue. So what I'd like to talk about is putting the building to work for you, business case for healthy buildings. Here's a nice picture of the Charles River in Cambridge. If it wasn't frozen, it's frozen right now. So the agenda, as I started to mention, is we want to talk about healthy buildings and human cognition, some of the research we've been doing at Harvard in this regard. Second, about the return on investment, like when is an investment in a so-called healthy building justified? There's lots of ways to think about this. It's pretty easy to know the cost. It's hard to know what the return is. So I'll walk through this actually with two income statements, a tenant income statement and a landlord income statement. My background before I came to Harvard Business School was in real estate and construction. So this is kind of the way that I think. And my collaborator, Joseph Allen, is a professor at the Harvard School of Public Health. He's an infectious disease guy. So between the two of us, we have taken this approach. And then we'll switch from that into who guarantees your building is safe for return. Because as we think about coming back from COVID, and you're in Southern California, it's even harder to think about coming back from COVID. The short answer is nobody guarantees this, but we can all do this together as building industry professionals. And then we'll talk about some of the ways in which this can be tracked around health performance indicators. And finally, a lot of the current technology and future business applications for these 6 sibilance settings, screening, surveys, statistics, standards, and sensors as these become more and more democratized. I'll pause after the pro forma part in case there are questions there, because there's sort of multiple phases to the conversation. And then we'll discuss it. So one phenomenon that's happened is as buildings have gotten tighter over the last 30 or 40 years, indoor air quality has gone down for obvious reasons. There's not as much fresh air coming in. And the sick building phenomenon has sort of arisen in all of our minds and sensibilities. So the idea of what's acceptable indoor air quality is largely set by standards from decades ago, and we argue that acceptable is not really acceptable. It's a minimum, but it's not really going to help people to be healthy and do their best. And here's some empirical research that, I'll get to that in a minute. And there are essentially 9 foundations of a healthy building that we talk about at the Harvard School of Public Health. These are pretty intuitive, and they would follow what you might think about in WELL guidelines or others, or fit well. Around thermal health, around moisture, like is it humid, is it damp, around dust and pests, that the building's not healthy if there's particulates or bugs or mice, around security, do I feel comfortable in the building, around water quality, both incoming and what happens to the wastewater, around noise, it's not healthy if there's all this cacophony around you, that's why many of you are probably wearing headphones right this minute, lighting and views, and then the top 2 are ventilation and air quality. And the reason that Joe and I look at these is because these are hard to see. The other 7 are pretty easy to perceive with your eyes or with just a thermometer. Ventilation and air quality are harder because you can't really see the air, but they're really important. So this is a book that I just published with my colleague Joe Allen from the Harvard School of Public Health. And you can see where Norman Foster, the architect, said we really need a new generation of humanitarian design ideas underpinned by research. And Lord Foster has been talking about this for a long time. And many of his buildings that have thought about about really the health of the occupants for quite a while. He's been a leader in this regard. So I'll refer to some of the research in this book. One of the aspects that many of you probably know is that we are the indoor generation. We spend 90% of our time indoors. So a lot of the air quality work is done around outdoor air quality. Obviously in Northern California this year when there were fires, there was outdoor air quality issues. Things like nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide are tracked in outdoor air. Why aren't we paying attention to indoor air? Because we're in our house sleeping, we're in our office, we're in some other place, we're in a theater 90% of our time. So one of the things that Joe and I talk about is what's your indoor age? We're sometimes reluctant to do this because it involves public math. It also involves telling how old you are. In my case, I'm 65 years old. So my indoor age is about 57. I spent about 57 years indoors, even though I'd like to go hiking and skiing and all those kind of things. So how does the indoor air affect us and how we think? So we've done double-blind experiments, refereed journal kind of things, reproducible experiments, specifically looking at human cognition in different indoor air quality environments. And this is a picture of work that we did in upstate New York in a facility where volunteers would come in and do their regular work for a week in these offices in the top part of the picture. Below, you can see where there's pipes and conduits, and three things were changed in this office space. One was the level of carbon dioxide. The second was the level of VOCs, volatile organic compounds. And the third was the level of particulates. And what we wanted to see was, is there an impact on how people think, just from these relatively low levels of materials? And we actually can't do human subject experiments above about 1,500 parts per million of CO2. But there are many environments that you sit in conference rooms or airplanes in the tarmac where there's 3,000 or 4,000 parts per million of CO2. So here's what the results were. And this probably won't be surprising to anybody who's interested in this topic. But these bars represent 9 different areas of cognition studies that we did, which is a well-understood multi-decade survey. And it looks at things like basic activity levels, focus, task orientation, crisis response, strategy, information seeking. And the bars represent how individuals did on all these tests as they took these various cognition tests while they didn't know what the different levels were of the particulates and CO2 in the rooms. So the brown is all meets code, but this is when we had the highest levels of CO2, VOC, and particulates that we could do with human subjects. And the dark green bars that are the highest are when we had the lowest CO2, which is about 410 parts per million, the lowest particulates, the lowest VOCs. Everybody did better by a measurable amount. Almost by standard deviation, as you can see from the I bars against themselves. So we're not measuring against the rest of the population, we're measuring against people. So what does this mean if you can demonstrably, empirically demonstrate that cognition is better? So Joe Allen and I set out to think, what would this mean to a real estate person? Because I've been a real estate person all my life. I thought about energy efficiency and embedded carbon and first cost. I hadn't really thought about this component of productivity. So I saw this presentation by Joe at the Harvard Center for the Environment and thought, we're really missing the boat as real estate people and as landlords and as tenants and as occupiers, and even in hospitals or in schools or in military installations, if we're not thinking about these impacts on cognition. So we set out to think what this would mean to a typical building tenant. So I'm in commercial real estate, but you can also apply this into academia or hospitals or schools or government. So we thought that it's pretty well understood that for a thought company like a law firm or private equity firm or something like that, about half of their revenue is then spent out in payroll. So you can see here in this pro forma, company with $6 million in revenue, $3 million in payroll, another maybe 10 or 20% is spent in rent. So here they have $300,000 a year in rent and $30,000 a year in utilities. A pretty common 3,300, actually 3,300 protocol that a lot of real estate firms talk about. And then we tested this against pro formas and other businesses. So this company's net income before taxes would be about 30% of revenue, like a thought firm like this. After taxes, about 20% of revenue. So then we thought, what would it mean if the people are actually performing better? And what would it mean if you spent more money on the energy and on the capital cost for them to perform better? So we think about these baseline assumptions, number of employees, salary, payroll, percent of revenue, and look at the things I just mentioned around the revenue, payroll, and rent. And the net income here is $1,169,000. Then you can look at a healthy building as compared to the baseline building. And the same assumptions about employee salary, payroll, or revenue, but there's a higher operating cost, about $40 a person per year if you run the fans more, and change the filters more. And what we looked at is the payroll effect on health of -1, meaning the payroll expense goes down because people aren't sick as often, they aren't absent as often, they don't turn over as fast because they like working here. And we looked at a productivity boost in revenue, meaning are they able to do 2 more reports, or write 1 more paper, or process 3 more insurance claims, or look at 1 more business case or something like that. And of course, this is very hard to track empirically, but it's not crazy to think that based on the cognition results we showed in the prior slide, that just something in the order of magnitude of 1 or 2% might be plausible. So what this means on the bottom right is that the operating expenses are more marginally, the payroll effect is substantial, and productivity effect is substantial as well, in this case, $120,000. So this firm winds up with net income for this company, this tenant, this law firm, private equity firm, consulting firm, of $1,272,000, which is a 10% change in their net income. That's real money that goes straight to the bottom line. So if it's so that improved cognition helps people do this work, why in the world do we have them in stuffy conference rooms that are poorly ventilated? Why do we have them in offices that aren't well ventilated? Why are we allowing these VOCs to off gas? All of you know this intuitively. Here's how we started to make the case for landlords and tenants. So having made this case, we thought, how would you go out into the commercial market and think about this? So Joe wrote this piece in the New York Times: your building can make you sick or keep you well. Proper ventilation, filtration, and humidity reduce the spread of pathogens like the coronavirus. This was in the spring, and we've both been writing a lot about COVID-19 subsequently. So we decided to look at this in the real world, and we wrote a Harvard Business School case study about 425 Park Avenue in New York, which is a new project designed by Norman Foster and developed by L&L Holdings. And they are claimed to be the healthiest building in New York, the first well-certified building in New York. And the argument here is that tenants are going to care that indeed the healthiest building in the world will be worth the rent. And then Joe and I did a lot with Urban Land Institute, which is my trade association. It's a real estate trade association, around how tenants and investors will be looking for healthy buildings. We knew this in June. It's certainly borne out now in January, and non-healthy buildings are trading at a discount, particularly in big cities like New York and Los Angeles. So this project is a lovely building in New York, 425 Park Avenue. It's the first new office building on Park Avenue in 60 years. And they've done a lot around building health. And we wanted to tease out, why is the landlord doing this? What's the return going to be for the landlord? Let me look at the numbers. So being a Harvard Business School finance professor, we built a pro forma along with the landlord around this. And what we're trying to tease out here is looking at multiple choices around healthy building options. So in the top here, you can see that we essentially said, what is the premium in capital expenditure for more filtration, more ventilation capacity? How can you size the ductwork? So a tenant might want more air changes, they might want HEPA filters or something like that, rather than just the minimum. And second, what would be the increase for landlord operating expense to do that? And then we looked at being certified. So it actually costs a lot of money to get well or fit well certified or USGBC certified, partly in paying for the certification and partly in doing the capital measures that allow you to become certified. So we were trying to justify where that makes sense or not. And all these light blue items in the red circle are ones that I allowed the students to toggle on and off, essentially looking for the boundaries of the zone of possible agreement, what you have to believe about the premiums to do this. And in this building, there's a large pro forma. It's 600,000 square feet. There's all these different kind of rent aspects. And we look at it as a classic real estate snapshot on a stabilized year, cash on cost return, what's the capitalization rate, that kind of thing. So in this baseline example, none of the healthy decisions were made. So they're all toggled off. Premium ventilation, no. Healthy building certification, no. Do we recommission the building annually to make sure that it all works the way we think it works? No, none of this stuff. All the decisions are no. So there's no impact. on the pro forma, this is basically the baseline. And so the impact on cash flow is zero. The cash flow from this building is actually about $75 million a year, but they didn't make any of the healthy building decisions, no impact. So then working with the developer and the architect, we derived the second pro forma that said, suppose you toggle on all the healthy building decisions. So in this indication on the right, it's the all healthy scenario. So we said, okay, the landlord's capital expenditure impact is 2% to upsize the ductwork and 3% to do this commissioning. Serious amount of money. The operating impact is small because most of the costs are passed on to the tenants, and the lender will get more rent. So there are two things you're trying to balance here. One is what's the capital cost, and the second is there truly a rent premium? And of course, that's the game, is whether there's a rent premium or not that determines the return on investment. So in this instance, with all these cost and rent multipliers, that there is more CapEx, there's also more OpEx, and there's more rent. With all these decisions as yes, this pro forma'd out as if the incremental cost to do these things is $12 million. It's a lot of money. The baseline operating cost is another $5 million a year, but the increment in rent is $9 million a year. So the increment in rent is $9 million against an operating cost increase of $3 million. That's about $6 million in more rent against a $12 million more capital cost. So from a cash flow over cost point of view, one-time CapEx 12 million, ongoing OpEx per annum of 3.5, ongoing rent 9.3, that's a 47% increase in cash flow over cost. For a building that's being developed to a 6 or 7% development yield, that's a huge increase. So do we believe it? And that becomes the question. And what L&L said is there's two things going on here in their view. One is they're trying to attract a total premium, actually three. One is they're trying to attract a total premium tenant. These are some of the best firms in New York, these private equity and consulting buyout investing firms who really want to attract the best talent and want them working as best they can. The second is they said in an up market, a good market, we think we'll get the premium. But, and they said this 2 years ago, we defend ourselves in a down market. If the market goes down, all else equal, we'll get the tenant, because all else equal for the same rent, why wouldn't a tenant go to the healthier building? So they think that they may not get more rent, but they will have more occupancy. And essentially those work out about the same. So that's what we're going to find out right now in this building in New York, which is coming online soon. So these are the basics of how you would think about the pro forma from a tenant's point of view, from a landlord's point of view, in a really complex situation in commercial real estate, where you have a misalignment of incentives many times between tenants and landlords. Let me pause right here because I want to talk about COVID after this, but let me pause and see if there are questions here. And I think that, Melissa, you might have been looking at some questions at this stage that you'd like to ask.
Hey, John, Larry Chang here.
Yeah, Larry.
We do have a few questions. Yeah, sorry about joining a little late here, but question here, a couple. In your study, you showed the increase in cognition with ventilation was a variable of natural light. So the question is, does more open ventilation correlate with more open windows, and similarly, more open windows to that, do they lead to more natural light?
I don't know that the ventilation and light are necessarily connected, because there's lots of ways to accomplish ventilation mechanically as well. So for those people who are listening who are passive house types, passive houses don't have a lot of glass area, but they do have a lot of thoughtful energy recovery, ventilation, and work on the mechanical piece in that regard. Somebody is probably going to ask about retrofits as compared to new construction. What we certainly find is in retrofits, the cheapest thing by far is open the windows. And unless you're in the middle of a forest fire, that's the thing to do. And that's the generally received wisdom in COVID time now is open the windows, blow that fresh air through. So that's the cheapest thing by far. Run the fans, those kind of things before you do fancy stuff like have ultraviolet in the ductwork. So the daylight can be related, but the daylight has issues around energy use as well. So I think our argument would be that the daylight, as part of a foundation of a healthy building, makes you feel well, but doesn't necessarily correlate directly to ventilation.
All right, yeah, we've got a few other questions, but yeah, why don't you go ahead and continue, and then we'll make the rounds on the rest of them.
Okay, good, I'll do. So Larry, if I've done this right, is this pro forma up here with all these arrows again? Have I properly screen shared?
Yes, that's what we have.
Okay, good. I always want to check that because you never know in Zoom what's going to happen with the real estate in the next 30 seconds. So let me continue on now and talk about COVID, because all the numbers before were pre-COVID. And we felt that a lot of landlords, particularly at the high end, could justify investing in an incrementally healthy building pre-COVID, just based on human cognition and performance and recruiting and getting tenants. And the downside of poor health was very small, because the downside was, yeah, somebody's out for a couple of days with the sniffles. Well, the downside of poor health is now obviously a lot greater. Somebody's out for 14 days on a ventilator. That's really expensive. So we think there's going to be much more attention to investing upfront in the capital cost to keep buildings healthy. And I'll go through in a minute to talk about when you balance capital investing versus operating investments. And that has a lot to do with what you do in a new building versus what you do in a retrofit. So we started to get interested in who guarantees that your workplace is safe for return. And the short answer is nobody guarantees this. The government doesn't guarantee this. The landlord doesn't guarantee this. Your college doesn't guarantee this. Your tenant doesn't guarantee this. But you as individuals can. And we in the building industry can think about this to think, how do we add value for clients throughout the supply chain? So one of the things that we've talked about a lot, and that Joe and I published in Harvard Business Review, is around what makes an office building healthy, and particularly about thinking about return to work after COVID. So you see on the right here, a hierarchy of controls. This is adapted for business purposes from best practices in public health. And like lots of pyramids, the smaller part is, and the bottom part is a wider one because it's big, but it's low because it's kind of unattractive. In this instance, the bottom of the pyramid is the elimination of exposure, lockdowns. That's very effective. That's the most effective way to keep from getting, from spreading COVID. Unfortunately, it's also the most expensive. That's why I put it at the bottom. The business impact is huge, and the societal impact and social impact is huge. And it's hard to be locked down for a year. So that works, but it works epidemiologically. It doesn't work socially. So the next on the pyramid doesn't work as effectively, but it's also less intrusive. Substitution of activities. This is essentially meaning essential workers, bus drivers, meatpacking workers, school teachers, nurses, doctors. They come to work, other people stay home. For most people on this call, we're in that category where we're academics or engineers who are working from home while we don't have to drive a bus. We don't have to show up and get our payroll cleaning a hotel or something like that. The next in the middle is around engineering controls and spaces. These are the physical things that all of us talk about a lot, and which Dr. Bonfleck and Dr. Walken will talk about in the next couple presentations. This is around more filtration, it's around ionization, it's around UV, those kind of things, or around larger elevators or touchless entries, things like that, capital expenses. The next layer up is administrative controls. These are less capital expensive. This is things like filling out surveys before you come to work, 6 feet of separation, having your food pre-wrapped instead of having a salad bar, having half the people come to work today and half the people come to work tomorrow. Those are all administrative controls that are less capital expense, more expensive to do. And finally is personal protective equipment, which is effective, not as effective as being isolated, but we put it at the top because it's the least intrusive. So every organization has decisions to make around how to optimize across this array of issues. And of course, a lot of those are financial, a lot of those are political, a lot of those are by sort of preference. And those of you in academia have seen every one of these things where you have schools totally shut down or schools totally wide open or things in between. So how do you know which thing to do? Well, part of that is by using health performance indicators. So the concept here is that what gets measured gets done. So this is analogous to key performance indicators that a lot of you have seen in strategy and in processes and things like that. And here we're talking about indicators in the building, indicators in the people. We're talking about leading indicators. What are you looking at in advance? Lagging indicators afterwards. Let me talk about the building first, in the bottom of the page. So leading indicators are things like what's the design of the building? Like, do the windows open? What is the ventilation? Or how many CFM per minute? How many air changes per hour? Are we continuously commissioning? Retrospectively, in the building, you can look afterwards at how's the space being used, how do employees perceive it, what's the retroactive commissioning, what was the humidity, all those kind of things. With respect to the people, you can look ahead and collect information like, how do we feel? Are we comfortable being here? And of course, you can look retrospectively at how many sick days were there, how many people were out, how many people were able to perform and not. So the idea is that we think that the idea of a concept of health performance indicators will get picked up by well, by fit well, by lead, and everybody else to say, here's how we're going to actually measure these things objectively going forward in real time around what we can do for the people and what we can do in the buildings. So then the question becomes, okay, how do we use these in practice? Because what gets measured gets done. And there are really 6 elements to this, and most of you are familiar with some of these. These elements get overlaid with the elements in the hierarchy as each individual building owner makes their decision about what to spend the money on. The first is around settings. Okay, how are you going to set the temperature? How are you going to set the airflow? Engineering steps. Where are we going to put the set points for the thermometers, then for the dehumidifiers, and for those kind of things? Pretty easy to do in this little screwdriver here. The second is around sensors. This is really interesting, around sensors and air quality and other measurable conditions, because the world is evolving so fast in this regard. So it used to be the only sensor in the room was the thermostat, or maybe you had the hygrometer measuring humidity with a needle. Well, now people go out and they can get, for $100, a very confident indoor air quality monitor that also is measuring CO2, PM 2.5, and VOCs in real time. The citizens can do this instead of waiting for the building manager to do this with a hygienist. Totally flips the power negotiation around, are you comfortable going to your office, going to your apartment, sending your kid off to school? The third is around screening. So the first screening that we all saw in buildings is skin temperature. Let's take your temperature. Now you have screening, which is essentially the rapid testing where you get results in 2 days, do I have COVID? Or you can think about who can come in. It's actually having buildings be analogous to when you have to go to the security or metal detector in the airport or a high office building. Will that all continue post-COVID? Not clear. It might continue for a long time, or it might take a long time before even this iteration of COVID plus the variants settles down between people's unwillingness to be vaccinated, and we don't know how long the vaccine is good for it, and those kind of things. The fourth is around surveys. Tenant well-being surveys, community behavior need monitoring. One kind of survey that I have to fill out every day is, if I go to see my physical therapist at Mass General Hospital, have you got a new fever? Do you have new shortness of breath? Blah, blah. Have you been exposed to COVID? No. Same thing if I go to a Harvard University building, I have to fill out Crimson Clear that says, yep, here's all this checked out. You also can see tenants having surveys like, are you comfortable with what your colleagues are doing in terms of social distancing, mask wearing, parties that they went to, those kind of things. Next is statistics. All of this stuff can be tracked in real time. So rather than say, yes, our building was LEED Platinum in 2004, I hope it still is now, or rather than saying, yeah, we set the kitchen oven for 350, I hope it's still 350 when I put the turkey in, you can get time series data on all this stuff. So my indoor air quality monitor gives me really compulsive time series data by which I can tell when I'm somewhere else if my wife is cooking, because the particulates and the chemicals go up so much when somebody's cooking. So we have real-time information that's available to all of you. And the last is standards. There isn't a standard. So yes, there's ASHRAE standards, which are minimums, which we think are below minimum in terms of cognition. There's people running around from WellFit, USGBC. There are large landlords thinking, okay, if we're Equity Office or Vornado or somebody national like that, Boston Properties, we can come out as a landlord and say, here's our standard for our buildings. You should be happy to come here because we've looked at all these things. Here's the dashboard for doing this stuff. Similarly, you can imagine academic buildings saying, yep, here's what we measured in 10 different locations in real time for CO2, VOCs, and particulates, which are actually kind of a proxy for how clean is the air. We can't measure for COVID in the air right now, although I have a former student who can measure for COVID in the waste stream. So all these things are happening, and employees and customers are interviewing your building or your client's buildings. Now, one around on the left is an unhappy employee writing in Glassdoor. This is a real review in Glassdoor. Coronavirus is finally showing the company how flawed it is with outdated technology and management style. What's the point of having 20,000 people in an office with circulated air? Why is this different than being stuck on a virus-infested cruise ship? You don't really want your building or your client's building to get that kind of review. They're going to have a hard time retaining employees, or you're going to feel back to work, or renting apartments or selling condos. On the right, management has taken the lead in handling the COVID-19 situation with the health and safety of its entire workforce of the utmost importance. In the face of the COVID-19 situation, I couldn't be happier with how this entire company is responding. Like, where do you want to work? Who do you want your clients to be? So these are the kind of issues that that we see in the world, the way we approach it, the way we think about cognition, the way we think about the pro forma. And of course, everybody's pro forma is different. And then about the hierarchy as you think about what things we do in our building, and finally setting sensor survey statistic standards and screening to think about how to be safe in COVID time. So I'm happy to take questions. In my view, the question answer part is always the best. So I'll turn the screen off, but if people want to refer to a particular slide, we can do that.
Okay, John, we've got a couple of questions about the relationship between increasing outdoor air and what impact that might have on energy efficiency, right? And one question specifically asks, is it possible, or are there examples of buildings that are able to meet energy efficiency goals while again meeting these healthy building targets? And someone also asked about the energy usage at 435 Park Avenue compared to other office buildings.
Great. Yeah, so that's a classic thing to think about, particularly when most of us in the industry have been thinking energy, 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 energy for the last 20 years. So part of what Joe and I are saying in the short run is that we kind of lost, as an industry, kind of lost track of the big target, because here we are with these super tight buildings, saving a couple pennies on energy, which in the example of the office there is like $40 per person per year, and losing thousands of dollars in productivity, partly because it's much harder to measure how the humans are doing, and there wasn't this kind of research in cognition until a few years ago. It's really easy for the building manager to say, I saved 3 cents a square foot by not changing the filters. So, you get a pat in the head. So partly the message is the industry is misguided, in our view, to be chasing just energy, 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 and winding up with sick buildings, mold, off-gassing chemicals, these kind of things. So the second part of that is it's absolutely possible to have healthy buildings and energy go together, but they have to do with tightness and with mechanical ventilation. So some of you are probably passive house acolytes. And a passive house doesn't use nearly as much energy because it has such a much better thermal envelope. Doesn't have thermal breaks, and has better windows and all that. It needs mechanical ventilation. So the mechanical ventilation comes from outside. It goes through HEPA filters usually, gets recirculated. There's energy recovery. So there's more capital cost on the insulation, more capital cost on the energy recovery, way less operating cost, because you're not using hardly any energy. Passive houses don't need much energy for heating and cooling, and the people are healthier because there's I forget what the measure is for outdoor air. Some people on the call probably know, and the air is being filtered. So that's sort of the broader answer is that thoughtful energy recovery, good insulation, way overcomes the problem of running the fans a little bit longer. So that's more capital. So then you have this CapEx, OpEx kind of question. And our argument would be in the short term, if you want the people to have less chance of getting COVID and be thinking better, open the windows, run the fans, run the heat a little bit more, you get a payoff in productivity. In the long run, the investments in insulation and mechanical filtration clearly pay off. Now you're going to have many more panels about this, and people might completely disagree with my conclusion, and that's part of the benefit of having me at the beginning of a conference like this, because now people can rebut it all day long.
And Are there any energy usage data for 435 Park Avenue yet? Go ahead.
No, for 425, there's not, because the building is just opening.
Yeah.
But the building, in addition to being well certified as LEED Platinum, so they've thought a lot about the energy recovery aspects. There's a lot of glass, but it's largely triple glazed glass, and a lot of this, I don't know the word for it, when the glass can change the emissivity based on different switches that you push. So there's a lot of CapEx in that building that not every building's going to do, so that they can chase down some of the energy numbers, because the tenants are interested in the health of the people. They're also interested in a lot of these people are fund managers who have an ESG, environment sustainability governance kind of filter, and they don't want to be in a building that's wasteful of energy. It's not that hard in a new building that's a high-end building to build a very efficient envelope. The question is much more, what about everybody else? You know, fancy building on Park Avenue is one thing. What if you have, you know, your mom and pop landlord and you have a 2-story building in, you know, in Ontario, California, and with 2 dentists and a law firm, the dentists aren't paying their rent. You know, that's a lot different setting.
Thank you. And let's see. Here's a question about displacement ventilation. Have you studied it in terms of human comfort and operating costs?
I don't know what displacement ventilation is. Do you, Larry?
I'm not familiar with that term. Maybe the person who asked that question, that's Sean Huberty. Sean, if you care to you know, elaborate on that in the Q&A section, then you know, I'll come back to that question. How's that? Okay. All right. Let's see. Another of our faculty network types has asked, you know, given that you know, a fair amount of the workforce is adjusted to working from home, how might this impact the post-COVID office rental market? And maybe if I could also kind of add to that, right? What does that also mean in terms of the definition of the workplace, right? That now you're not just confined to a commercial building, but now you're looking at people's home offices. What's the kind of the business management's responsibility for kind of assisting with any improvements? Yeah.
Isn't that an interesting question? So if I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't be sitting here with you guys. I'd be out speculating in commercial real estate. But you know, the answer is it depends, and I'll give you a, you know, a business school teacher kind of answer. So one is, if somebody tells you they know the true path of what work from home and offices are going to look like in the future, they're lying. Nobody knows what's going to happen. But circumstances are really different. And let me describe a framework for thinking about that. And it has to do with a couple scenarios. So there's a couple things we know. Actually, there's 3 things we know that aren't going back in the bottle. One is that people's awareness of the health impacts of this pandemic and the next pandemic and the one after that are never going to be damped down. This concern about public health and communicable diseases is with us forever. The second is the work from home aspect has really accelerated. So the ability to do a conference like this on Zoom that works, or on GoToMeeting or on Teams or on Skype or something else, has really accelerated. We're all really comfortable doing this, probably accelerated by 20 years, the awareness of this technology. And the third is that people have air quality monitors. So that exists, that's not going away. None of those genies are going back in the bottle. They can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. So how are people going to react? And there are a couple scenarios around this, and I express this as COVID and oil. And you may think this is kind of weird, but hear me out. So one scenario is that in the next couple months, we get COVID completely under control, completely figured out. We have everybody's vaccinated. There's herd immunity. There's something. We have a cure. You know, remdesivir works or something. Or we don't get COVID figured out. You can get it again. It's with us forever, like dengue and yellow fever. And there's a mutant and another variation. And then 5 years from now, a different virus will emerge from somewhere else. And we'll always have this stuff in mind. The second is around the price of oil. So, and we're all energy sustainability people, so let's go through this. Right now, a barrel of oil in the Brent exchange is about $50. That's historically pretty low. A lot of nations need 80 to 100 to meet their budgets. If oil stays low for a long time, partly that means the economy hasn't recovered, and partly it means driving is cheap. If oil gets expensive, goes back to 80 or $100, that means the economy is recovered and there's demand. That means driving is expensive. So you can see where I'm going here. If we figure out COVID and people get comfortable with their own routines and driving gets expensive, that encourages density, inner city, public transit. New York says, hey, we're back. If we don't figure out all these public health kind of issues, and if driving is cheap, that means more sprawl. It means hello Bakersfield. It means we're going to sprawl further and further out, which is terrible from a carbon point of view, but you can see why people would do it. And that would indicate that central core cities, New York, Los Angeles, particularly older buildings with non-operable windows and undersized ventilation, are not attractive. But suburban office parks where you can drive to your office and don't take an elevator to your office, or garden style apartments like in Inland Empire are important. That's really unknown. And so if you're a commercial landlord, you have to be thinking about how to be ready for any of those scenarios to occur. So then you overlay onto that people's comfort with working from home, and that would really indicate in many ways a retreat from central cities. So if I only have to go to work once a day, I don't mind driving. I don't mind riding in the bus from Rochester, New York to New York City once a week. Well, that's pretty far. But from Albany to New York City, or from Manteca to San Francisco once a week, if I'm going to be doing that, it's different than every day. So that would indicate a re-sprawlification in a sense. Nobody knows. It's also kind of an elite thing to think about. Not everybody's an office worker who can work on Zoom. So the people in the meatpacking plants, the people driving the buses, people making cars, the people working in hospitals, the people who are working day to day, who are doing farm jobs or cleaning jobs, they can't work on Zoom. So it becomes a very kind of elitist conversation about what's the future of downtown, what's the future of lower Manhattan as compared to what's the future of Fresno. So the point being, I don't know, you don't know either, but you have to be ready for any of those two scenarios to happen and think about your own individual portfolio. And essentially as a commercial landlord, what's the rent? Like if I'm only getting $20 a square foot, I'm not going to spend $5 a foot fixing this stuff up. If I'm getting $150 a square foot, I'm happy to spend $5 a square foot fixing things up. So all those things have to be balanced.
All right. Back to our question about displacement ventilation. All right. It's an air distribution strategy where conditioned outdoor air is supplied at low velocity near the floor and extracted usually at ceiling height. So essentially air is brought in nearly fully exhausted.
I'm not an expert on that. I mean, it seems to me like that had plenty of merit anyway. There's capital cost again around the built up floor as compared to the stuff in the ceiling, but the questioner probably knows a lot more about this than I do. There's also advantages to having the temperature where you want it, to having the cold air low instead of high. So, so you have a lot of draft kind of advantages as well, but I'm not really qualified to comment on that.
Okay. Here a more kind of high level question about the healthy building perspective. Right? Is it gaining momentum among building owners and the real estate industry, such as the large outfits like JLL and CBRE?
The short answer is absolutely. Even pre-COVID, it was gaining traction because it started to become clear that there wasn't just anecdotal evidence here and there of sick buildings and Legionnaire's disease and bad carpets, but there clearly were people who were missing out on productivity. So Joe and I have done work with a lot of those big, multi-letter firms in both real estate and in general management consulting around healthy buildings for them and for their own clients, even pre-COVID. Post-COVID, it's really accelerated. And most of the real estate conferences I'm part of or panels that I'm part of have those big owners or big consultants doing a lot of work in this regard. It kind of exacerbates the haves and have-nots and scale a little bit. So if you're a national landlord, a real estate investment trust that doesn't have a lot of debt, then it's pretty easy to go out and spend capital costs and operating costs to be able to show that your building is healthier than the other guy's building. And you have a staff of 4 or 5 or 8 people who can get qualified to judge this. If you're a mom and pop real estate owner who has a lot of debt and doesn't have anybody on staff who can kick the tires around these things, that's a lot harder. So as with every economic cycle, this down cycle in real estate, office, hotel, and retail is going to flush out a lot of the worst properties and weaker holders. The big question is what will be the demand for those assets going forward? Will there be as much demand for hotel even post-COVID if people are more comfortable on Zoom? Will the pressure on retail that's from COVID also be accelerated by the pressure from Amazon and online people or the big boxes like Home Depot? All those are really unknowns, but it looks like it's going to be an acceleration of trends that already existed. So the real estate question sort of is, okay, how healthy is your building? Is there like a brown discount because your building is not healthy? Where is your building? And if it's really attractive, are people going to want more square footage because there's going to be more office space? Or will they figure out that distancing and the layered displacement ventilation and other aspects will let people still be in cubes and bullpens?
All right. I think, let's see here. Someone's asked about the models you showed. I believe he's referring to the pro forma cases, right? Are they available for download anywhere?
Excellent question. Here's one way. Oh, I'm sorry. That's weird what the camera does, huh?
Right.
That's pretty strange. Anyway, showing my book. So the performers are in the first part are in the book. The second ones are in the case study by L&L Holdings. But if you remind me, Larry, I'll put a PDF together and send it to you, and you can just share that. I'll put a PDF of this presentation,
right? And
they can work from that. And then the teaching notes for the 425 Park Avenue case study have the live Excel in it, and the other one, as I said, is in the.
Okay. Here's one about tenants, occupants, and their willingness to kind of voice their opinions. We don't complain about poor indoor air environment, and often we don't demand better indoor environment. Do you think this is a reason why building owners and all others are perhaps more passive about these factors?
I think there's a pre-COVID and a post-COVID answer, and a pre-personal sensor, post-personal sensor answer. So the pre-COVID answer is yes to the question. So the post-COVID answer is your company wants you to come back to work. You may not want to come. Like, I'm not going back to Harvard until I live in Cambridge. I'm still not going to go on campus until I'm more comfortable with some of these things. And the same is happening when you look at swipe records, at least in New York, there's like 12 or 15% of the normal building people in these buildings now. So they're not coming because they aren't comfortable. And now they're going to come armed with air quality monitors. They're also going to come with Lysol and masks and everything else. So if you're able to, if you go to your office and you say, oh, the CO2 is 2,000 parts per million, and there's, I forget the particulate measures, but there's 300 or 400 the PM 2.5, this air is just not healthy. And it's more likely to have other pathogens in it than air that is healthier. So I think there are going to be people showing up with their own air quality monitors. And if you can detect COVID-19 RNA in stool, in sewage right now, somebody's going to figure out a way to detect this in the air. And that will completely change that negotiating relationship.
Just having more data available.
Yeah, and more democratized. So for those of you who live in Northern California, some of you probably use Purple Air. And Purple Air was this network of people with their own outdoor air quality monitors, monitoring where the smoke was from the fires and sharing this information in real time, crowdsourced, democratized. That puts the power in the hands of individuals rather than the power of landlords and banks. And that's really different.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. This next question I think is almost kind of the flip of the last one, right? How can we convince more building tenants that health and energy efficiency are worth pursuing?
So when Joe and I first wrote this book pre-COVID, that was the big question. How long will it take this information to percolate? And as we all know, this industry changes really slowly. Like when I came into construction almost 50 years ago, there were no rubber roofs. It was all built up asphalt and gravel. And Carlisle and Goodyear and these people figured out you can have a membrane with rubber, then it became EPDM. But it took 30 years for that to propagate and people to get comfortable that it wasn't going to leak and the warranties were good. Similarly, it took decades for elevators to percolate. It took decades for air conditioning, and it took a long time for fire protection. These obvious things that now we think about. And even now, all of us in this call are familiar with green buildings, but there are people out there who say, oh, LEEDs, that's the album by The Who or something like that still. So the question is, how fast will this propagate? And for Joe and me as teachers, we're interested in thinking, how can we use an example like Norman Foster and 425 Park Avenue to propagate out in the rest of the industry? We think that going to increase the awareness of users around the importance of public health. They're not just going to read about a couple buildings in Georgia that had bad drywall. They're going to read about people all over the world who are succumbing to these various plagues. And they'll become much more interested in healthy buildings and demand it. So you think if you're going to go rent a new apartment, you're going to be asking these kind of questions. If you're a tenant company looking to go to a new building, ask these kind of questions. If you're thinking about going on vacation, you're going to ask Delta and United, and Marriott and Hilton, what are you doing in your hotels? People aren't going to stop asking that. They're going to get more sophisticated because right now they're looking at what we call health theater, which is people are scrubbing stuff all the time. We know that the coronavirus is not spread that much by fomites, by the stuff on the surfaces, it's spread by aerosols. Yet you see people like crazy, but you can argue that they're actually worse off because Lysol wasn't meant to be used 6 times a day. And here we are breathing in all this Lysol and Clorox that we, so we're almost worse. But the point being there's health theater and there's actual measurements and health performance indicators around sensors and settings that we think will mean that individual consumers like citizens and like tenants and like school administrators will start to adopt to get the benefits of building health.
This next question is about public buildings, all right? The Park Avenue model is really fabulous, but in a time where the public sector is seeing far less revenue than it would normally, right? How can we help municipalities kind of overcome this to start retrofitting their buildings? Yeah,
huge issue. So one of the avenues for entities where all the budgets under the same roof is interesting. So you have municipal buildings, schools, military, those hospitals, factories, where it's not a commercial endeavor where you have arm's length relationships. It's all under one payroll. So if you think about the cost to a city of having these people be ill, or the cost to a city of having its people in low-income housing be on ventilators or be in oak boxes, that's really expensive. And you could easily make the argument that there ought to be more capital costs spent in public housing around ventilation, filtration, water, and in government buildings around ventilation, because it's going to be saved on the healthcare side. Now, somewhere in the governor's office or the mayor's office, all these budgets come together. In real life in government, they're very siloed, and the person responsible for changing the filters does not talk to the person who's responsible for the health costs. But once they figure that out, there'll be lots of justification for spending more money on healthy buildings up front to save money down the road. A way that might get shortcutted is if insurance companies start thinking about health performance contracting the way that some of you on this call have thought about energy performance contracting. So you think about when there was still low-hanging fruit in warehouses around bad insulation and incandescent lamps, and people would do the insulation and put in halogen or LEDs, and an energy contractor like JCI, Johnson Controls, or Ameresco would put in the lights when they get paid by the savings. it's pretty easy to see CVS, Aetna, or Kaiser, or some Kaiser Permanente saying, we'll spend the money on the ventilation and the filtration because we're going to save it down the road in what we're paying for sick people. And that would also apply in City Hall, in theory.
Sounds like there may be some new opportunities for public-private partnerships.
Yeah.
John, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. We're now reaching our closing time here. Just if you have any kind of parting remarks, welcome you to make those. And I just want to remind people that we do have a small group discussion towards the end of the day around 3 o'clock around the future of commercial real estate. So we can continue this discussion at that time as well. For any questions we didn't get to, I'm going to forward those to John, and hopefully we'll get those and we can share them afterwards. So John, any parting comments?
Thank you. Yes, there's really three. The first is people have the capacity to have these individual air quality monitors. That really changes the negotiating dynamic. The second is open the windows and run the fans. Spend a little more energy, keep the people healthy. And the third thing, of course, is be healthy, be safe, everybody. And thank you very much for having me. This was really a pleasure.
Thank you again. And I would also encourage any, as well as you, John, to perhaps go to special chat room that we've created. It's called Meet the Speaker, right? If you have some time, John, and want to take a couple more questions, you can get there via the chat on the navigation bar.
Chat on the navigation bar. Okay, I'll do that.
All right.
Good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody.